I'm Dr. Pete Economo, the East Coast psychologist,
And I'm Dr. Nikki Rubin, the West Coast psychologist.
and this is When East
Meets West.
So it's finally here, the episode on values. Hey, Nikki.
Hey, Pete. I know we've been like doing some teasers for this one for maybe like the whole time we've been doing.
Why haven't
podcasts.
what has taken us so long?
I think just I think things come up, and I think we're also we do talk about values. We weave it in quite a bit, so we're like
Yeah.
I think we sort of maybe have felt like we've been addressing it, and then we kind of realized no, we have not like formally discussed this.
We have not. And the other thing is, I think it's so common in our vernacular, like it's something that
Yeah.
we talk about on a daily basis. That
Yeah, that's
and I
right.
think, hey, listeners, we need you to remind us about that every so often, because we do forget once in a while, and we're not even sure who our audience is. So, hey, audience. So values, and Nikki, I'm gonna give you a definition. How do you feel about that?
Oh, well, I'm curious where this definition is coming from. I'm like getting ready. I'm like, am I gonna have to combat what Merriam-Webster has to say, or let's?
Well, I like to always go to our
I know. Well,
Merriam-Webster.
that's why I was making that guess here.
So she, Miriam, has three: the monetary worth of something. So that's right, value, obviously.
Sure. Yeah.
A fair return or equivalent in goods, services, or money for something exchanged. A relative worth, utility, or importance.
So the third one is inching
Closer. Oh wait.
towards-
I'm
yeah.
sorry. There's a lot more here. The fourth is something intrinsically valuable or desirable. So that's a combination. We're getting there.
Sure, we're getting there.
I don't like the fifth, relative duration of musical. Okay, so none of those really work for what we're trying to do.
Okay. Well, so I'm like, oh, good. My ACT definition is
So give
ready
it to
to
us.
go. Okay. So values, when I say values, like to patients when I'm introducing them, I'll say like, look, it's this thing, as Pete's kind of already hinted at, we all like know kind of what values are, but it's really rare that we sit and define it.
Yeah.
And from an acceptance and commitment therapy lens, when we talk about values, we're talking about a couple of things. We're talking about basically verbally defined. That's an important piece of it.
It sure is.
Yes, a verbally defined direction that basically we can move towards.
Yeah.
So, in American culture specifically, like we're really goals oriented, and I
Yes.
want to be clear, obviously there's nothing wrong with goals. Like, Pete and I do problems and goals lists with patients all the time. Like we're
Yes.
like, what are we going to be working on? Right. But values are really different because just like direction, there's literally no endpoint. Like you can't achieve west, right? Like you
Right.
can go all around the globe. Like I could start traveling west from LA. I can end up back in LA. West hasn't been achieved. It's infinite. So right. So values.
A good
values
visual. Hopefully
yeah,
listeners
it's a good,
get
yeah,
that.
yeah. So values function the same way. And then I'll add in this really important piece. And when we're thinking about or acting in alignment with our values, they elicit one or more of the following feelings. And that's a sense of meaning, purpose, vitality, which is like a sense of being alive,
Mhm.
fulfillment, contentment, connection, vitality, like groundedness, or like a sense of being solid, or warmth.
Yes.
So, those are there, and there's like there's no end point to those either. Like I always say to people, like those are bottomless wells, right? Like there's no point in your life where you're like, well, I've just felt all the meaning I can feel. Like I'm
Well,
good.
and one of the metaphors we use, and one of the metaphors we use is like if we're heading west, if I'm leaving New York here on the East Coast, and if I want to go through Chicago to get to LA to visit you, but what if I decide along the way to go to Montreal?
Or you get lost and end up in Montreal. Even
And how often do we get lost?
all the time, right?
So those are our values. Right?
Yeah, well, we can reroute, right? Like
We
that's what
reroute
Pete's
because
getting
I'm
at.
trying to get to LA.
Yeah, you're trying to get to LA. So it's like,
Right.
the values are our compasses, right? They help us determine where we want to go. That actually, Dr. Robin Walser, who we had on last season,
Yes,
talking about
hey, Robin.
existential. Yeah, hey, Robin, talking about existentialism and behaviorism. Robin has this wonderful way of saying this about values, as she often does. She says values help us determine which direction we want to point our feet in, so then we can start walking. And I love that, because it's like, how often do we like feel stuck in our lives? Like, what do we want to be about? Like, who are we? What are we doing? And
Yeah.
for most of us, it doesn't occur to us like, oh, I get to choose what I connect to. I get
Yes.
to choose what's important to me. And I get to then choose which direction I go.
Right. And choosing is not about accessibility. I mean, choosing means if I'm broke, I can choose to go and fill out the paperwork to get some assistance. I can choose to save some money, and rather than going and buying like an extra large soda, I'll buy a large soda. And I think that's the thing that values are. It helps us, because in that moment, like say for example, in that example, I need to eat. Right. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we need to have our basic needs met. And that's part of our values, where I might, if I'm really tired and I want to go out because I'm having FOMO, fear of missing out, for those that don't know, I may have to choose to sleep and miss out on an opportunity to socialize with somebody that I want to socialize with.
Yeah. Well, and I think, Pete, what you're getting at here is that what is going to be workable to focus on in a given moment with regards to our values is going to vary based on the context. And you and I talk a lot about context on this podcast, because context is a big part of contextual behavioral science, right?
Yes.
That the moment, and obviously part of mindfulness, which is like this moment where the only moment we ever live in and occupy and have agency over our behavior in, is going to determine what's going to work to focus on. So, we don't just have one value. Like you're saying, like, we get to choose, like if you value financial stability and you don't have, finances right now, you get to choose, first of all, if that's something important to you, if you connect with that value, and then you get to choose what behaviors you might want to engage in that align with that. Though also you might say, using the other example, like you value friendship, or you value, I don't know, socializing, and you also value rest. You might choose rest, the behavior of sleeping or staying home in that moment, because that's more workable than, going out to the party. It doesn't erase your connection to that value. It's just that moment is going to tell you what you need in that
exactly
right in that moment, right?
There's nothing other than this moment. So maybe we'll break down a couple more exampple. And I'll say I believe values are universal. So whether I'm in Ethiopia, in Sweden, or in the United States, whether I'm 8, 18, or 80, right? I mean,
well, it's so funny. You can see, Pete can see my wheels turning behind my eyes. I know when you can see, again, if you're watching the YouTube channel, you can see our, how we're talking without talking.
Yeah.
Yes. So I think there's like a wonderful dialectic here present, right? Which is there are many values that are universal, and there are many values that are individual.
Of course.
Right. And so I think that it's really important to say, like, we as individuals get to choose what we value, and we may share values with like our culture, our country, like our spiritual community, our friends, whatever context we move through. But I think, the reason I think that's so important is because, like, for example, in American culture, highly values individualism. This is the example I was using, right? And so I say, like, you may or may not value individualism if you're an American or live in the United States.
Right.
You might value community-oriented approaches like collectivism. You might value collectivism and individualism, right?
There's your dialectic.
There it is. Yeah. So
well, and middle path, right? So I think that's also part of the Zen thing there.
Yes.
Is that it's this middle path of, like, it's not just one or the other. And that's the thing about values. Again, listeners, thinking about, if I'm traveling east, I will get lost. What values do is it helps point our shoes in the right direction, get us back on track, steer us in the course of where we're going. And I'm going to break it down. Like, I actually look at it universally in a more global way is probably what I meant better. So so the way that I look at values and some of the worksheets I use are like work and career, romance, education, learning or knowledge, friends and social life, health, family of origin, spirituality, community environment, recreation, leisure, or parenting. So those are like kind of the general that I use.
Sure, you're gonna laugh. You're gonna laugh because I'm gonna challenge you again on it, which I was gonna say is
do it.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say that those are universal. I would say that they are those are common, like, categories, right? Yeah. Those are common overlaps. Like it would. I don't know. I don't think I've ever worked with somebody who didn't value respect or kindness.
Right.
Like that's always come up, but I've worked with some people, for example, that value adventure and others that don't, right?
That's right.
So
well, but adventure would be under like recreation, and respect maybe could be under like career or family of origin. So I think like, so that's the thing I think with ACT, and I'm sure you've done this exercise where we have like the values cards where there's like 100 different values or so.
I don't like it.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, because I think, okay, why don't you like, so listeners, like, so there's this exercise, there's about 100 different values, and it's things like, I mean, anything you think of, really, like, I don't know, like world peace, inner love.
Or like literature, I always say to people like science.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Well, okay. So what I don't like about that exercise, and what has always very much puzzled me in the way values are taught, like if any of our listeners, Google acceptance and commitment therapy, values exercises, values clarification exercises, you'll come across some of these on the internet. It's that, and we've talked about this a lot on the podcast, is that the way humans are wired is that we're wired to categorize things, right? We're wired to like chunk information, which makes sense from a processing standpoint. However, it really gets in the way of flexibility and curiosity and opening up. And so what I've found clinically is that when I, in the past, used to use those categories, I found that people got stuck a lot more, that they had a lot harder time sort of like greasing the wheels of their mind to open up to like, what do they connect with? Yeah. And so I teach it a different way. Like I actually just model for people, like we'll do an exercise where I'm like, I'll say a value, you say a value, and just, like
really, Simon says.
Yeah. And I'll say to them, like, you don't have to value what I value. If what I say resonates with you, write it down. But like, I'll do it to model sort of like, Pete's going to laugh when I say this, like, I'll say to people like, like dogs. You can't achieve dog, and then people are like, oh yeah, that's a value. I'm like, yeah, it's a value. Absolutely. It's a value. So like, that's not in the card sort, and I feel like people get stuck because then they get in that mode of like, I've got to do it the right way, or like, what's my social responsibility category? So I'm just always I'm always thinking about how can I continue to also cultivate that psychological flexibility. So that's my Nikki Rubin approach to values.
I like it. And like, I think we're saying the same thing, I think it's about accessibility.
Totally.
I think it's, I'm going to think about this because I'm not sure why I have felt so committed to like the one worksheet, which has these like 10 basic values, because I feel that they're global, is that the perception that I've taken, like everybody has something about that. And 9 times out of 10 people come back and they're like, parenting, I don't have kids yet. I'm like, yeah. And is that in your cards? Like, is that something that is important to you at some point?
Yeah.
Because I think that's up for me, again, as this is like a roadmap that does help people make decisions. So that, like, for example, if I have like somebody who's in a midlife crisis, who's like, I want, trying to settle down, but then it's like, they're struggling to find out of whether or not, like, when to settle down, how to settle down. And like, it's like, well, why settle down then? Maybe you don't have to.
Totally. No. And what Pete's saying is totally on point, that it's about defining the directions that you want to head, even if you are not walking that way yet. Like I'll say to people, just because you've never traveled north doesn't mean you don't get to travel north. I think what I want listeners to maybe think about is that, we can get, and I'm always obviously fascinated by this as a psychologist, that we can become rigidly attached to anything, and we can get kind of stuck in this sort of like box type thinking about anything, including values. And so what I'll say to people is, I want you to like go inward and connect with how you feel. So like if it's parenthood, if someone's like, well, I don't know, I don't have kids, like, and I'll say, okay, well, and I've done this with many patients, when you think about parenthood, like, what do you feel in your body?
Yes.
And then I have them write down those feelings I like as a little like menu, and they'll say like, yeah, I guess I feel kind of warm. Yeah. And I'm like, okay, well then that's something. That's the information about like that. This, pay attention to that, as opposed for me personally, as opposed to, because I'm also, I think, it's the first time I've ever thought of it this way. I think it's because I myself can get overly attached to like the categories and like doing it the right way. And so I think I found like that.
Because you're a better student.
Well, I don't know if it's that. more like a goody two shoes, probably.
a little bit of those both, because of course,
a little bit of a rule follower,
a lot of bit of a rule follower.
Yeah.
Because
So
for me, it's like, oh, this works. Like, let me just see what finds it. So
yeah, and I'm like, ooh, danger zone. I gotta expand here. Yeah.
Oh, I liked it. Yeah, I liked it.
Yeah.
Well, and let me ask you this. Can I ask you a wordsmith question?
Oh, I love.
Do you think
words.
is virtue? How close would the word virtue line up with value?
I like this question very much. I think that so I would say, obviously, Pete and I are native English speakers, so I'm speaking from that lens. I would say that in English, virtue is like a little bit more like baggage laden, like it's got like a flavor of judgment in there, I think. Because it sort of implies like moral high ground or something like that, whereas value again comes back that more non-judgmental of like, what do you connect with, like what do you want to be about? That's my opinion about it.
Well, because in Buddhism we teach about virtues, and I was kind of thinking that they are the values in a way, so they are generosity, and they're called the perfections or the paramitas. And so I felt like that was maybe part of the values, because it's generosity, proper conduct, renunciation, wisdom, energy, patience, honesty, determination, goodwill, and equanimity.
It is, this is, and I can't remember what episode we discussed this in, but this is the one we talked before about like the translation of like right effort, right speech, that I'm so curious about, like, because I feel like the message behind it is the same thing that we're saying, but the language is this, maybe in English, more of sort of like a tint of a judgment, but and the translation.
Right? I agree. Well, it's probably translation, and it's probably that this is a spiritual scripture, which in and of itself is infused with judgment.
Right. Interesting. So you would say that.
Yes. And
interesting.
I'll also say that the non-judgmental like teachings and approach is really what attracted me to Buddhism, having been raised Catholic, where Catholicism is a lot of what not to do. It's all the judgment, like if you do this, this will happen to you.
Right.
Whereas Buddhism is more like, hey, do this. Like this Eightfold Path will help you,
like
find help you move. And so I think that these paramitas, like, yes, there is that flavor of judgment. So I think we're picking up on it, but I'm kind of feeling this like synonymous.
Yes.
This synonymous texture between values and virtues.
Yeah, I'm totally with you on that. And I know we've also said this before on the podcast, and we actually talked about it in our spirituality episode last season, that for me personally, values and spirituality are intertwined. Like I always sort of like, once I sort of got into exploring values, I kind of, for me, I'm sort of like, I can't tease those apart. That of course isn't going to resonate with everybody, but I think that's interesting, when I hear you talk about it in that way, because that makes a lot of sense to me and I connect with that.
Yeah. So, I think hopefully, listeners, they found something, to take away from today. Values are simply guiding us into whatever direction we're going, and we have the choice to take the step into that direction.
This has been When East Meets West. I'm Dr. Pete Economo.
And I'm Dr. Nikki Rubin. Be present, be brave.
This has been When East Meets West. All material is based on opinion and educational training of Drs. Pete Economo and Nikki Rubin.
Content is for informational and educational purposes only.